I appreciate that, Brother Guyton. And when he asked me about that, and I think I had just turned in my John Calvin outline a few days earlier, and I was kind of relieved that I was done with it. And then he asked me about it, and as far as Presbyterianism goes, and I didn't know, I knew not to be offended, but I didn't know whether to be happy about it either, because but it just tells me that he had enough confidence in me that I'd do a good job, and I appreciate that. I do want to clarify something that Guyton said a while ago. He mentioned about Ray and me being in the closet back there. Now, there is a closet in that room, but we're in the larger part of the room. We're in the, there's a storage thing, and I just want to mention that, but I told Ray I'd mention that just for to be funny, but I do want to again appreciate the opportunity to be here, and of course want to talk for a few moments about Presbyterianism, and of course when we think about this particular subject matter, and I kind of approached it like I did with John Calvin, more in a historical way rather than a doctrinal perspective, because we're dealing in the other lectures with some of the false doctrines that come from that. Presbyterianism is basically a Calvinistic denomination. They hold many Calvinistic principles, and those are being talked about in other lessons. So I kind of approached it in a historical rather than a doctrinal way. I just wanted to mention that. But we're going to be looking at a historical look at religion in Scotland, and that is a lesson in itself. Because if you go back and look at the history of Scotland, it's very colorful, and we're going to look at some of that to begin with, but then we're going to get into the Scottish Reformation and the characters involved in that, and again they are very colorful in nature, and not only theoretically but also literally as well, and we'll get into that just as well. But we want to consider John Knox, his major role in the Scottish Reformation, the difficulties he faced because of his efforts, and the fact that here was a man who came out of very humble beginnings, born on the shores of Scotland, and, well, right off the shores, but his father was like a farmer, a peasant farmer, but he ended up going from that to standing before and against the royalty of his day. And he was well respected by the royalty, and he was also not so respected with others. But he had to deal with them based upon the political environment in Scotland at the time that he was there. But want to consider, first of all, a brief historical look at religion in Scotland. And to really understand it, we need to go back to the beginning. And going back all the way to around 122, and that's when Hadrian's Wall was built, there was an effort in the first and second centuries to reach this area, reach England as well as Scotland, as far as with Christianity is concerned. It reached the British Isles through the colonization of Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D., according to the Church of Scotland's website. We also want to mention that about 70 years after the Roman army conquered England during the reign of Claudius, and you think about when Claudius was. Claudius is also mentioned, I believe, in Acts chapter 12. So this is around biblical times when he actually reigned. And his plans were to continue north. And of course, Hadrian's Wall was constructed about 122. I just mentioned that date a while ago. And that basically separated the northern part of England from the southern part of the landmass of Scotland. Of course, it wasn't called Scotland at that time, and we'll mention where that name came from. And there was also another large area of land that was north of that, and the Antonine Wall was built about 20 years later, about 142. And it divided the northern landmass of that. Now, Rome continued to colonize the land, but the armies feared battling the northern people. Now, I mentioned colorful a while ago, and these individuals were known as the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, in our English rendering of that word, and it means the painted people. And of course, we're going to get, a few centuries later, we're going to learn more about some of that. But during this time of colonization, efforts were made to evangelize a tribal people, the people that were already there. They were espousing various customs, cultures, and backgrounds that include Druids and the Celtics and different types of cults and their practices and things of that nature. And according to, and Rome actually withdrew in 410 AD. And of course, they had their own things that they were dealing with because they actually fell in 476. Yeah, so they had other things at home to deal with. But according to David Ross, he says, though the Celtic people of Scotland must have been exposed to Christianity through their contact with the Romans, it was not until the 6th century that the new religion made inroads into the northern region. And of course, that's where these pictures were. And I get the impression that, not that the Roman army feared them, but maybe they did not see the need to go much further than they did at the time. Now, if you go back and look at the history that the Presbyterians present as their history in Scotland, because they were formed in Scotland, they bring out two people that came from other places into Scotland in order to evangelize, if you will. And of course, this is during times when the apostasy was in full-blown force, and we'll get into that. And in fact, even around the time after Constantine. So, but there was one by the name of Ninian, and he was a Roman British native, so who came to the Solway area around 397 AD, and he established a monastery at Whithorn, and with an emphasis on aesthetic living, which indicates that he had some Gnostic influence in that regard, because that was based upon that teaching, not upon New Testament Christianity. There has been archaeological evidence that has been dug up in Whithorn that they found writings and things associated with him. And his monastery became a famous center for learning. By the time of his death in 432 AD, he had covered the Strathclyde region, began missionary efforts in eastern Britain as far as north as the Shetlands. There was another individual by the name of Columba. He was an Irish prince, so he's from Ireland, and he was a warrior and a monk, but he was also a prince. Now, he left Ireland because he had ran into some trouble there. He was exiled for having an indirect hand in causing a tribal war in which thousands were killed, and guilt from that battle influenced him to become a missionary of sorts. Now, in 563 AD, and I brought some water this time because I was dry mouthed very shortly into my lesson Tuesday, and I hopefully learned my lesson. Columba and 12 of his companions traveled to Scotland in an Irish fishing boat, and they arrived at Kintyre, and then they came to a small island on the west coast by the name of Iona. Now, he was given an island of Iona by the king of Dalriada, and on which he founded a building and a monastery, a church building. Now, here's where we get to the name Scotland. It was actually a derogatory term, and I find it's interesting, these derogatory terms, they seem to stick. And we're going to look at another one a little bit later that they had for certain individuals that were early reformers in Scotland as well. But the term Scotland, the name Scotland, actually has as its root the derogatory term Scotty. And the Romans referred to the Gaelic-speaking pirates that raided Britannia in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and that's where it got its name. So when I mentioned that the landmass was not called Scotland at that time, it was not called that until centuries later, and it was based upon a derogatory term, a slander, if you will. Well, they may have deserted, I don't know, they were pirates, about these individuals that were Gaelic-speaking pirates. Now, according to the Presbyterian historians, a fellow by the name of Preston, that this fellow Columba proclaimed a Celtic Christianity. Now, so you have a pagan religion, and then you have a mixture of some things in regard to Christianity, or the whatever form of it they had at that time, a preferred form, no doubt. And this is what he proclaimed. And it's described as a blending of Christianity as it spread to Northern Europe with the Gaelic cults of Ireland and Scotland. It was distinct from the Roman Church and was far more in harmony with the Celtic beliefs and practices. So it had more to do with the pagans than it did with anything in relation to what Rome was pressing. And again, this has to do also with the independent spirit of this particular country, and that has a lot to do with why the reforms, they actually started earlier in Scotland than in other places, because of that rebellious nature, if you will. And of course, we also want to look at one other figure before we get in further, by the name of Mungo. He lived from 518 to 614, and quite a long life. And he is referred to as Saint Kentigern, and he's also prominent in Scottish religious history. He was actually the illegitimate son of a Pictish princess, so he was native to the land, but he was conceived as a result of a rape. Now, she had been cast out of her home because she left paganism for Catholicism. And of course, Kentigern, he founded a monastery in St. Asaph in Wales before returning to Scotland, and he established a British see, or an ecclesiastical jurisdiction, as that's what it refers to, at Haddam. And he would later move to Glasgow and establish a cathedral there. And one profound effect on the spread of Catholicism was that religion now acted to tie together some of these people that were separated because of the paganistic cults that they were following, and that had separated them. So then we come a few centuries later, around 843, the House of Alpin was formed, and it politically brought a semblance of order to Scotland. And now we're going to get into something that we are more familiar with in just a moment. The Middle Ages, and this was already mentioned before, and we talked about it last year. The Middle Ages saw the major split between the eastern and western segments of Catholicism in 1054, resulting in the Catholic and the Orthodox dynamic, the Pope and the Patriarch. Now, Scotland, at that particular time, it lay within the Western Catholic Church, and this period saw the building of St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, and the Cathedral in St. Andrews, and the great abbeys of Iona, as they are called in their history books, Paisley, Broath, and the Borders, and elsewhere. And of course, then we come to something I think we may be more familiar with. Several years ago, there was a movie called Braveheart, and it dealt with the history that I came across in this research. The Wars of Independence from England and Scotland culminated in the death of William Wallace in 1305. Robert the Bruce galvanized control of Scottish independence. Now, he did not have a son, but he had a daughter. He had a daughter by the name of Margaret, who married a nobleman in Scotland, and his last name was Stuart. They had a son, those two, and there was established from him the House of Stuart, which continued as in Scotland until the latter part of the 17th century. And now, 7 years after the beginning of this House of Stuart, the Catholic Church found itself divided between rival popes, and I think this was mentioned earlier, in Rome and Avignon, which is in France, and Scotland sided with the Avignon Pope, Pope Benedict XIII, while England remained loyal to the Pope at Rome. And so you still had this England and Scottish rivalry going, if you will. Now, there was a papal bull that was put out by Benedict XIII in 1413, which allowed for the building of Scotland's first university at St. Andrews. Now, I mentioned that because that plays an important part a little bit later in the history. And of course, the papal decision was healed in 1417, and later we find that Pope Sixtus IV raised the see, or the diocese or whatever, of St. Andrews to an archdiocese. And of course, Pope Innocent in 1492, Pope Innocent VIII accorded the same honor to the See of Glasgow. Now, when we think about the early reformers of Scotland, and we've been talking about Luther and of course Calvin and of course mentioned Philip Melanchthon and some of these others, even 70 years before the time that even Knox was around, there were proponents of reform being executed in Scotland by the Catholic Church. There was a fellow by the name of James Resby who was burned at the stake in 1407. There was another fellow by the name of Paul Crawford. He was accused of importing the doctrines of Wycliffe and Huss, for which he was convicted by the church and burned at the stake in 1433. Now, another nickname that we're going to mention here was given to some early reformers. In 1494, there were 30 Lollards of Kyle that were summoned before the Bishop of Glasgow, and they were part of the Ayrshire movement, and they were referred to as Lollards, and the word Lollardly actually is a derisive term that means muttering. In other words, it's somebody listening to someone and they're not making any sense, and this is how it appeared to Rome as far as what they were espousing, and we'll look at just a few things here. And it was used to describe the radical teaching of John Wycliffe. And of course, he was mentioned, and the one whose remains were dug up and burned and thrown on the River Swift. Now, the Lollards were charged with repudiating religious relics and images, auricular confession, priestly ordination and powers, transubstantiation, purgatory, indulgences, masses for the dead, clerical celibacy, and papal authority. And this is according to Durant. And what's interesting here, their objection of not allowing the clergy to marry stemmed from the Catholic Church. They're turning a blind eye to the fact that the clergy had concubines and were not really practicing celibacy. They were just not marrying. And of course, I think we are aware that that was going on, and that's been mentioned in other subjects as well. And they also argue for the right of the people to read the Bible and to worship in their own language. And of course, that's the idea of the radical teaching of John Wycliffe, who was instrumental in making the Bible known in the languages that the people could get the Bible and read it for themselves. Now, Scotland's religious and political turmoil is described by Latourette, who is a historian, and he said that lawlessness was rife. The nobility were turbulent, unwilling to submit to royal authority, and dividing into warring factions. Some episcopal sees were vacant, and where they were filled, their incumbents were embroiled in the political strife of the realm. And many ecclesiastical posts were given to sons of nobles who enjoyed the revenues, but absentees did not perform the associated duties. So they took the check and went home. The country was torn between those who wished closer relations with hereditary foe, the English, and those who stood for the traditional anti-English tie with France. So we find Scotland divided between, there are those that want to separate themselves from from England, and those that still had some type of loyalty to England. And this is long after the Scottish independent war. And not only was Scotland facing a great internal conflict at the time, the country was walking a political and religious tightrope between the Protestant England and Catholic France. Half of Scotland's wealth belonged to the Catholic Church. And the motivation, and this is humorous because it speaks about why Knox's father wanted him to get into the priesthood, but half of Scotland's wealth belonged to the Catholic Church, and the motivation of going into the priesthood had more to do with filthy lucre than spirituality. And it was viewed as a stepping stone into political power. And during this time, there were good people that were withdrawing, and the corrupt people were going after the power. And there is a misprint in the book. I was going over this, studying it, and I'm sure it transposed over because I didn't change it, but that is James the Fourth rather than James the Sixth. James the Sixth, we'll read later, was somebody that came later, but this is James the Fourth. He is mentioned here. He was a competent leader who was impressed with the Renaissance. He tried his best to implement what he saw were great advances of the Renaissance way of thinking. Of course, going back to the classics and learning and of course being more literate as far as Scotland and all that by studying the classics. England and France had just gone through the 100 Years' War. Both were recovering from loss of life in finances, England more so than France. And of course, there were advantages and disadvantages in allying with either England or France. So he allied with both of them. This is James IV. There was a treaty by the name of the Ald Treaty with France, and then he ended up marrying King Henry VIII's sister, Margaret Tudor, and that solidified his ties to England. But because it solidified his ties to England, it also, because he was related by marriage, he put himself in a very bad predicament, because he was at the behest of request of King Henry VIII, which would go against France, because King Henry VIII had already started the Anglican Church, Church of England, and of course France was staunchly Catholic at this time. And so he was playing both sides of the fence. Now in 1513, James was killed in the Battle of Flodden, and of course the history of this is King Henry VIII initiated this war with France. He was defeating them in their own yard, and France called upon James to honor the Ald Treaty with them, and they desired that he attack England from the north so that the English army would move from their southern, from France, and send resources to battle there, and so that the French would have a fighting chance. So what happened is that he did this. He was a diversion, basically, and he was killed in that battle. Now, with the death of James IV, his son, James V, and nephew of King Henry VIII, ascended to the throne of Scotland. And of course, that would have been in 1513. Now, this is where we start learning about John Knox, and I know I got to hurry about this. So I'm going to hit just some highlights, but if you have the book, all this information is there. John Knox was born between 1505 and 1515. Now, I find it interesting that it depends on who you read as to when they date him. Philip Schaff talked about the fact that he believed he dated him around 1505, but there are some that date him later, which indicates there really were not records available to maybe indicate when he was born. But he was born on a farm on the coast of Scotland that was openly exposed to French raiders, French pirates. And of course, he grew up constantly facing threats that would come from the sea. His father, he was a bright student. His father invested as much as he could, being a farmer, into his son's education, thinking that it would bring finances, if you will, and stability to the family if he got into the priesthood. Now, he went through the educational system, did very well, but he never took a degree. And I find it very interesting. You know, these days you go to college and you pay for the college, or a lot of them coming out in debt now, but they still get their degree, they're just in debt. Here, the way it went is that you could go and you can get all the education that you wanted, but you have to pay extra to actually get the degree. That at the time, the degree cost more than the education that led to it because of the corruption that was in place, and Catholicism certainly had their hand in that. Now, he was called John Sir Knox, not because he had a degree, but because he was known to have been educated. So he never actually got the degree, he just got the education because he could not afford the degree that came with it. And of course, during his studies, it struck him as odd that the entire religious system in Scotland was politicized, to the extent that the religious leaders were far more concerned about worldly matters than the spiritual welfare of their parishioners. Now, he did not see how this coincided with the study of Scripture, especially John 17, with which he particularly familiarized himself. And of course, this had to do with the prayer of Jesus, the prayer on behalf of those who would learn of him through the word of his disciples, and that they would be one, and things of that nature. That stuck with him, and he saw the have and the have-nots, and those in authority preying upon those that were at their mercy. And he was troubled by the spiritual condition of the church, having been educated to take a role in it, and this was a driving force that carried him on. Now, there are other things that took place that further pushed him into it, into the Reform movement. A fellow by the name of Patrick Hamilton, who was a popular professor at St. Andrews, he was burned at the stake by Cardinal Beaton, who was the most powerful Catholic in Scotland at this time. This was in 1528. It greatly affected Knox because Knox had grown to appreciate this man. And what had happened, he had been educated at the University of Paris, so he went to Paris, was educated, came back to Scotland, and while he was there in Paris, Luther's writings were being circulated. He got a hold of them, and they persuaded him toward the Reformation. Now, in classes, apparently, he did not push his beliefs about that, but he would have students over to his home for gatherings, and he would openly discuss those matters. Now, Cardinal Beaton got wind of this, and what he did is he sent spy students to these home meetings, and they were there. They came back, reported back to him, yes, he is a Reformation sympathizer, and he is pushing some of the ideas of Luther and leaning toward those. And because of his popularity, what they did to him actually spread throughout Scotland as far as what they did. It's that when it was reported back to Beaton that he was espousing these views, Beaton had him arrested at home during the night, and get this, he was quickly tried, convicted, and burned at the stake within an hour or two of his taking in. In other words, he was trying to do it, I guess, during the night, so maybe it wouldn't get out, but because of his popularity, the news of his death hit the Scottish people hard. The lack of toleration for the exchange of ideas, the hardline injustice of Beaton was upsetting the people at large, including John Knox. Now, that's a fellow by the name of Hamilton. Now, years later, we're going to, and I'll probably skip to that because that's significant to what we're going to talk about. But Knox wrote concerning this, the reek of Master Hamilton's burning has infected as many as it blew on. And of course, Knox would later, he at this time became a notary or tutor for a wealthy family in Scotland. The family was sympathetic to Reformation ideas and played a role in influencing Knox in that direction. And of course, there's a relationship that he had with Mary, Queen of Scots as well, and have information that's in the book concerning that. But one of the things that Mary, Queen of Scots, that she was James married James V married Mary Guise. She was from a family of French nobility. She was a strong Catholic, and feared by many that she would bring a lack of toleration of the Reformation to Scotland. And we find that Mary was born to this union, Mary Queen of Scots. However, Henry VIII had a falling out with James because he would not align himself with Henry against Rome. Since James' wife was a strong Catholic, he decided not to go along. He wanted peace at home, so he did not do that. But what happened, Henry VIII initiated a war. James became involved in that war, and he was killed in that war. It did not pay to be a friend or related to Henry VIII at this time. And he was killed in the Battle of Solway Moss. James's daughter Mary became Mary Queen of Scots when she was 5 days old. That's how old she was when he was killed. And of course, since she was only 5 days old, they couldn't rule herself. There was a protector government that was set up at a regency, and the House of Arran won that, and they leaned toward the Protestant Reformation. So you had the Queen, Mary Guise, being a strong Catholic. You had her daughter, who now has a protective regent, who is a Protestant. And so again, you have that turmoil going on at this time. And of course, I want to continue. Another fellow, and this had to do with George Wishart, and this kind of led Knox even more toward the Reformation because he had been this notary with this family. And now we have George Wishart, who became well known and beloved in Scotland as a result of his work in the city of Dundee. And now he had been a professor at St. Andrews. He was a scholar in the Greek New Testament. His knowledge of Scriptures led him to understand the value of the principles of the Reformation movement. And his preaching greatly influenced him. In fact, John Knox became his bodyguard because he would travel throughout Scotland. Some places were Catholic, some places were Protestant. So he took a bodyguard with him to make sure he was protected wherever he was going. But there was a place called Dundee that was a city quarantined with the plague. Now, the Catholic Church had pretty much written the city off. They withheld care and ministering there. They considered the residents to be doomed and simply awaiting eventual death. He went several times to Dundee, preached to inhabitants, kept a short distance as not to be infected, but he brought a message of hope, or at least of the Reformation idea, and this made him famous across the country. But Cardinal Beaton hired a fellow by the name of Earl of Bothwell, who had police authority to arrest George Wishart. He was immediately put on trial with Cardinal Beaton serving as the prosecutor, and we find that he went on trial, and he was quickly condemned, convicted, and burned at the stake just outside of St. Andrews. And of course, he had everything stacked against him. Now, the death of Wishart, this really was something that started people being more interested in the Reformation there. He was seen as a hero and a beloved figure by most of Scotland. Even those who did not necessarily support the Reformation, they had respect for him. Now, 2 months after this, there were two individuals, they were Scottish nobles, James Leslie and John Melville. They broke into St. Andrews in the middle of the night. They inquired of a servant in the hallway as to the directions of the bedchamber of Cardinal Beaton. And here's what happened. He advised him that they would recognize his room as his mistress was about to exit. And as she left, the nobles went into his bedchamber and killed him. King Henry VIII had actually promised £1,000 toward the expenses of those who would kill Beaton, and so he was involved in that, and it took place on May 29, 1546. And listen to this, the people of Scotland, this tells you how much they loved Wishart. The people of Scotland were generally enthusiastic about Beaton's death, as he was universally despised, and even those among who regarded themselves as loyal to Rome did not like Beaton. And concerning his death, Knox would later write, he said, now because the weather was hot, it was late May, it was thought best to keep him from stinking, to give him great salt enough, a cope of lead, to await what exquisites his brethren, the bishops, could prepare for him. These things we write merrily. And that's what I mean when I think of him being a colorful person. It has to do with the fact that they took pleasure in taking the life of this individual that had caused so much misery for the early reformers there, including Wishart, including Patrick Hamilton, who were trying to make inroads in Scotland, and their lives were being taken. Now, after the murder of Beaton, the Protestants quickly seized control of St. Andrews, and it became the headquarters of the Reformation and the Civil War of Scotland between the Catholics and the Protestants. And he was asked to be the official preacher. And I know I'm coming toward an end here. If you have the book, and I'm sure all of you have it, I'm only at point number 6, but and I think I have 9 altogether. So I do want to mention the fact that as he traveled, he ended up coming back to Scotland a bit later. He had actually been, when the French came, the merry guys called the French, they basically shot cannons into St. Andrews. We find that Knox was captured along with those who survived that. He was put in a French galley for about 19 months. The French galley was a boat, and they sat in the bottom and they stirred it. It was considered a death sentence to anybody who was not in prime health at the time they put there. It turned out that King Henry VIII died in 1547. His son Edward actually had as a regent his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, Edward Seymour, who was a strong Protestant. Seymour knew about Knox. He knew about his situation. He was able to get Knox out of the French galley. He did a prisoner exchange, and Knox was broken in health, emaciated, diseased, and appeared to be at death's door, but he became the court preacher in England as he recovered. And he was there for 3 years until young Edward died due to ongoing poor health. That's when Bloody Mary came into power, and of course he had to flee at that time. Of course, he ended up going to Geneva as he was fleeing, ran into John Calvin, and was there one time. Calvin was busy with some other things. Michael Servetus had just been burned at the stake, and there was turmoil going on. So he left. He went to Scotland a few months. He established the most blessed word of God in his congregation with the nobles there. They were called Covenanters, and this had to do with those that were dedicating themselves to the reform ideas there. He returned to Geneva, and by this time Calvin's situation had stabilized. They formed a fast friendship. It's here when Knox would say that Geneva was the most perfect school of Christ on earth since the day of the apostles. Now, again, and we talked about Calvin, and we didn't get into that because we ran out of time as well. We find that Mary Tudor died in November 1558. Her half-sister Elizabeth ascended to the throne. The persecution stopped. Elizabeth was actually supported the Protestant movement. And because of that, she and Knox became, I guess, close. She was a strong promoter of the Reformed England, as well as John Knox supported his ideas. And of course, he ended up going back to Scotland. There was a Scottish Civil War because Mary Geist outlawed the preaching of the Reformation principles. And there, at that particular point, and what's interesting about this, it caused a civil war. And at the death of Mary Geist, we find Mary Queen of Scots coming back from France. But by the time she came back from France, the nobles had formed a parliament, and they actually outlawed Catholicism, or the Mass, in Scotland in 1560. And I find that very interesting. So she went back to Scotland, and what she sought to bring back there and to rejuvenate Catholicism in Scotland had already been outlawed by the Parliament. And so she dealt with him and of course made no headway with him. And in fact, he preached a few blocks away from the palace. She was actually having Mass in the palace chambers because she would not have it publicly because it had been outlawed. And of course, he had made some accusations against that, put him on trial. He was found not guilty. In fact, he declined a defense lawyer. And of course, then she ended up marrying Lord Darnley, who had her personal secretary killed. I mean, this sounds like a soap opera. And Lord Darnley was murdered by a guy named Lord Bothwell, who she ended up marrying, thinking that maybe she was involved in that as well. Then, of course, she ended up actually going into hiding for a while. She abdicated the throne. And anybody that knows the history, she actually fled back to England. She was accused of trying to assassinate her sister, involved in a conspiracy. She was killed, executed in 1587. This is Mary Queen of Scots. And of course, then he actually preached at the coronation of James VI in Scotland, who was actually James I in 1603 in England. And of course, he's the one where that got the scholars together for the King James Version. So these things do play into what we're talking about here. And Knox ended up dying on November 23rd, 1572, had been in frail health since the time of his servitude on the French galley. He was actually in poor health. That what killed most, he survived it, but it did bring him to poor health. And I will close with this. Philip Schaff describes Knox in these words. He called the hero of the Scottish Reformation, though 4 years older than Calvin, in other words, he had been born in 1505, sat humbly at his feet and became more Calvinistic than Calvin. John Knox, the Scot of the Scots, as Luther was the German of the Germans, spent 5 years in his exile during the reign of Mary Tudor. We talked about that. Most at Geneva, found there, he said, the most perfect school of Christ that was ever since the day of the apostles. After that model, he led the Scottish people with dauntless courage and energy from medieval semi-barbarianism into the light of modern civilization, and acquired a name which, next to those of Zwingli, Luther, and Calvin, is the greatest in the history of Protestant Reformation. Now, and we have to understand that these quotes that speak so highly of these individuals are people that are, sympathetic to the Reformation. And of course, we've made comments about these men. It took great courage for these men to do what they did, but they did not go back far enough. They were trying to change what was there instead of just starting over and going back to the Bible. And that was the failure of the Reformation movement. And I have some more information, even dealing with the Scots Confession. This is still the official creed of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, even today. And and these things were actually written by John Knox there at the end of your book there. And I appreciate this, and I promised him I would stay within my allotted time. I think I did better than I did Tuesday, though, and he's shaking his head yes. So thank you for your attention. There's a lot of material there. I skipped a lot, but it is in the book, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you. Thank you very much, Guyton.